let's take a look at Mark 12. And I'm calling this At the Theatre. Now Mark 11, among other things, is about the fulfilment of Malachi chapter 3, which anticipates God himself coming to his temple. And so Jesus in Mark 11 comes to his own temple. And the temple is the one place in the whole nation where one would hope to see a clear expression of God being loved and worshipped. Now, some smart aleck pointed out that Solomon's temple was located on the side of Solomon's head. Now, you may have seen photos of people with huge tumours. You know, these tumours that grow on their faces, and they cause these really gross distortions of their features. And when Jesus looked at the temple of his day, he saw a massive tumour on the face of Jerusalem. In Mark chapter 13, his disciples expressed their admiration for the magnificence of the temple facade and the buildings. But what God sees, what Jesus sees, is ugliness. And the temple reveals why it is that God is not getting any fruit from his vineyard, from his chosen people. And by his actions in the temple, Jesus curses the temple. And to symbolise this, Jesus curses a fig tree, causing it to wither and die. And that's what lies ahead for the temple, for Jerusalem, and indeed the Jewish theocracy. Alfred Nobel was a great guy. He was a scientist, engineer, the founder of the Nobel Prizes, and he's also the guy who created dynamite. In fact, he was so amazing that he blew everyone away. Now, on TV you saw the massive and tragic explosion which took place in Beirut on August the 4th. It was this large stockpile of ammonium nitrate which exploded and caused at least 190 deaths and left over 300,000 people homeless. In Jesus' telling of the parable of the talents right at the beginning of Mark 12, Jesus lights a fuse. And as we walk through the contents of Mark 12 and watch the flame creep along the fuse wire, we're coming ever closer to an explosion of unprecedented proportions. Of course, back in 586 BC, that's when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. They took the whole population, with just a few exceptions, into a temporary period of exile. About 70 years, wasn't it? But what happened in 586 BC was but a toothache compared to the permanent consequences brought about by the explosive events of AD 70, which Jesus is looking ahead to in Mark 13, which is when the Romans not only destroyed Jerusalem and the temple yet again, but that's also when the theocratic Jewish nation was ended forever, never to be restored. There was a teenager who visited his grandfather in hospital, and the old man launched into a tirade against today's youth. And pointing to the iPhone in his grandson's hand, he said that youth can't live without technology these days. His deeply offended grandson called him a hypocrite and unplugged his life support. Now, the temple was the life support system for the Jewish nation of Jesus' day. And Mark 12 builds on Mark 11 and explains why God is going to destroy the temple, that is, unplug the life support system. Why? Because the nation's leaders are hypocrites. Now, hypocrisy, by the way, simply means play acting. And this means the temple had become a theatre. It was a stage upon which the nation's leaders strutted. And, as actors do, they pretended to be something they were not. Now, significantly, immediately after Jesus' programmatic parable, at the beginning of chapter 12, we are presented with an encounter about the hypocrisy or the play acting of the corrupt leaders and their attitudes towards money when they talk about paying taxes to Caesar. And then Mark 12 ends by denouncing the leaders as heartless play actors and addressing attitudes towards money. You know, the widow putting her money into the temple treasury. Now, all of the encounters and all that Jesus says in Mark 12 is related to the temple. And behind the talk about paying taxes to Caesar stands the temple, now a marketplace, not a place of worship. Behind the talk of resurrection is a temple in which is the stench of death, not a place of encounter with a life-giving God. Behind the talk of the most important law is a temple where religious rituals, burnt offerings and sacrifices have made it unnecessary to love God and love your neighbour. If you want to be right with God, don't worry about that. Just tend to the religious stuff. Behind Jesus' emphasis on the Messiah being Lord stands the reality, played out even as Jesus speaks, that those he encounters at the temple are not those who love and revere him, but his enemies, who are going to end up being put under his feet. The temple is a place associated with leaders whose lives are theatrical, showy, self-seeking, and who exploit the vulnerable, such as widows. They devour widows' houses, and that's the key point, isn't it, behind Jesus' attack on the teachers of the law later in the chapter. And the temple is the place where vulnerable people like widows are treated as non-persons. It's only Jesus who sees the devotion of that poor widow. So this chapter, it speaks volumes to you and to me. I mean, God is looking for us to use our money and our material resources wisely and well. God is revolted by spiritually dead people who play religion but have no living relationship with him. God is looking for us to genuinely and wholeheartedly love him and to love others and not kid ourselves into thinking he will be pleased if we do religious things. God is looking for leaders who are the real deal and not just show ponies. You know, leaders, he's looking for leaders who care for the vulnerable amongst us. And God is looking for all of us, isn't he, to willingly and enthusiastically treat our lives as wholly belonging to him and to give our very best, even if it may seem extremely paltry. Going to Mark 12 is like going to the theatre and watching a play involving 7 scenes. And the tragedy is that while this drama does involve a lot of acting, it is nevertheless deadly serious. It is indeed a tragedy in the fullest sense of that word. Well then, let's look at scene 1, which I've called Foxes in the Vineyard. And that's looking at verse 1 to 12, the so-called parable of the tenants. It all begins with Jesus telling a story. Now this is not Jesus telling us a nice bedtime story. It's a highly disturbing and highly confrontational story. And it's by telling this story that Jesus indeed lights the fuse. And you can see that in the reaction of the religious leaders. Immediately in verse 12 we're told that they rightly understand that this parable was spoken against them, and so with murder in their hearts they try to find a way to arrest him and only desist because they don't want the crowd whose popular support they crave to turn against them. Now, we all know about the Brits and their fox hunting. Well, in the 1870s, the red fox was introduced into Australia. I guess so that British settlers here could do the same thing in Australia as well. Anyway, numbers of the foxes increased rapidly, and they now cost the Australian economy over $200 million per annum for the damage that they do to vineyards and orchards. And the tenant farmers of Jesus' parable are like foxes in the vineyard. I mean, this parable is a major study in itself. For now, we're just going to have to content ourselves with having a broad outline of what Jesus is getting at in this parable. He compares God's people to a vineyard and its leaders to tenants. God's prophets are compared to the servants that God sends to get the fruit that's due to him. But time and again, Israel's leaders, they treat this vineyard as if it's their own, and they reject the prophets and sometimes beat them and kill them. Now Jesus, he compares himself with the owner's much-loved son and clearly prophesies that the leaders are going to kill him. And it's this atrocity in the parable that will bring the owner's wrath, God's wrath, down upon those who are responsible, which is a clear foreshadowing of AD 70. We're anticipating Mark 13. He's going to make that much clearer, isn't he, in the next chapter. And in the wider context, it is apparent that Jesus' parable particularly has in mind leadership associated with the temple. And indeed, you'll notice that his story finishes, doesn't it, with the rejected stone himself implicitly becoming the cornerstone of a new temple. So that's scene 1 then. Now, when we move from scene 1 to scene 2 is about a taxing situation in verses 13 to 17. Historically, relations between the Soviet Union, the United States, now Russia and the US, have been strained or downright hostile. But from 1941 to 1945, they formed an alliance to fight a common enemy, Hitler. Now, the Pharisees wanted to get rid of the Romans. The Herodians, on the other hand, they welcomed the Roman occupation. But now these naturally opposing groups join forces against a common enemy, Jesus. And so in these verses, in this first encounter, we have an illustration, don't we, of the truth of Jesus' parable. You know, the leaders have indeed conferred, and they've decided they need to get rid of the heir so that the inheritance might be theirs. And so they challenge Jesus to show that he's a man of integrity, that he will speak his mind plainly and not care about who might be offended for the sake of speaking God's truth. And they speak as though they too shared these same values. So ironically, their words highlight their own lack of integrity, their addiction to public adulation, their fear of the Romans, and their willingness to use deceit to further their own ends, the exact opposite of what they're attributing to Jesus. And the trap they are baiting is expressed in their question. Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not? Should we pay or shouldn't we? Now, given how Jesus entered Jerusalem and the way the crowds hailed him, what he did and said when he drove the traders out of the temple, they're assuming, I guess, that Jesus thinks of himself as the Messiah. Now, back in AD 6, there was a guy called Judas the Galilean who came to a sorry end after leading a disastrous revolt. And they're thinking that Jesus, too, as a would-be Messiah, would think that paying taxes to Caesar was wrong, just as Judas the Galilean did. And they would want him to say so. They want Jesus to say that so they can cast him as being like Judas the Galilean as a dangerous rebel. But if he avoids saying this to save his own skin, then Jesus will lose credibility with the people and he'll just prove to be a gutless wonder. Now, Jesus does not rise to the bait. He knows their hypocrisy. And his answer, of course, is magnificent, isn't it? Give back to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. Now, today, the American dollar is not viewed as the personal property of Donald Trump or the American Congress. The Australian dollar is not the personal property of Scott Morrison. But in ancient times, the imperial coinage was considered to be the personal property of the Roman emperor. He certainly saw it that way. And the coins that bore his image in his mind were his. And so when Jesus says, give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, he's reflecting the understanding of the day. But even here, his wording does allow, doesn't it? It allows room for us to think seriously about what is really due to Caesar and what is not. I mean, Jesus leaves it pretty open-ended, doesn't he? And one wit quipped, people that cheat on their taxes truly disgust me, and this is not the world I want to raise my 27 dependents in. Now, when it comes to giving back to Caesar what is Caesar's, we should be no more fudging here than when we give back to God what is God's. Indeed, giving back to God what is God's actually includes giving back to Caesar what is Caesar's. And other New Testament teaching takes what Jesus says here further and develops it and reminds us that we must be good citizens, we must honour the emperor or the equivalent, and submit to the ruling authorities as put there by God. So Jesus' answer is truthful, it's not evasive, but it also skillfully turns the tables on his opponents. It leaves them not merely amazed but stunned. It says they were amazed at the end of it, but I think stunned would be a better translation. They end up exposed as being in an indefensible position. Give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give back to God what is God's. Now, we could ask ourselves, couldn't we, whose image and whose inscription is etched on every human being? And we are created in God's image. And to give back to God what is God's is to present our lives to him as a living sacrifice. But the temple most certainly has become a place where people, for all their burnt offerings and their sacrifices, they do not give back to God what is God's. So we can now see how that flame is moving further along the fuse wire. Jesus' opponents, they wanted to impale him on the horns of a dilemma. And Jesus turns the tables. He impales them on the horns of hypocrisy. He asks them to bring a coin, and they do, showing to all onlookers, in the light of what Jesus says, that they're in bed with the Romans because they've got these coins in their possession. I mean, the traders that Jesus drove out of the temple were there because the religious leaders connived with such practices, and they were dealing with imperial coinage. And significantly, Mark 12 ends with people implicitly putting such silver coins, imperial coins, into the temple treasury, in contrast to the copper coins of the widow. And so there's no way that the religious leaders really deserve to be respected by the people. So that's scene 2. Well, we move now to scene 3, which is really a matter of life and death that's involved here, verses 18 to 27. Because in this next encounter, the Sadducees come along and they try to make Jesus look like a fool, and they end up being exposed as ignorant morons. Now, remember that Jesus' parable at the beginning of the chapter does not end simply with the death of the owner's beloved son. I mean, no, he goes on, doesn't he, to quote from Psalm 118, implicitly identifying the murdered son with the rejected stone, and yet indicating that God has done a marvellous work in our days, of taking that same stone, that is the murdered son, and making that stone the cornerstone of a new building, a new temple. So that clearly implies that death is not actually the end for God's Son, but that he will be raised to life. Now later on, in chapter 14 and verse 57, we read that at Jesus' trial by the Sanhedrin, some stood up and gave this false testimony against him. We heard him say, I will destroy this man-made temple, and in 3 days will build another not made by man. Now Jesus was also insulted while writhing in agony on the cross with the words, so you who are going to destroy the temple and build in 3 days, come down from the cross and save yourself. And as we know, Jesus was speaking about the destruction of his own body as God's temple, and of that same body being raised up after 3 days. Now, this is all a pipe dream if the Sadducees are right and there's no such thing as resurrection, because they deny that there is such a thing as resurrection. Now, scholars do debate how much of the Old Testament the Sadducees accepted as canonical, but they did have special respect for the books of Moses, and so it's appropriate that Jesus should take them back to the burning bush and to God's words to Moses. I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Not I was the God of Abraham, but he's dead now. Not I was the God of Isaac, but he's dead now. Not I was the God of Jacob, but he's dead now. But I am the God of Abraham right now. I am the God of Isaac right now. I am the God of Jacob here and now. That at least is implicit, if not more. Now it is interesting, isn't it, to see how a widow is central to this debate as part of the question that the Sadducees raised with Jesus. Indeed, widows are mentioned at 3 different points in this chapter. At the heart of Isaiah's parable of the vineyard, which is in Isaiah chapter 5, verses 1 to 7, which Jesus is reworking in his revised version of that parable. There's this truth in Isaiah's parable. When Israel's leaders fail to produce the fruits of justice and righteousness, it is especially the vulnerable members of society who suffer, for example, widows. And the selling of doves in the temple, and back in chapter 11, it probably implies the exploitation of marginalised people such as widows. The Sadducees, as their example illustrates, were extremely patriarchal in their thinking. And Mark probably wants us to see in the very example they're using with Jesus of these 7 men all being married to this widow. They're all concerned about who the woman is going to be married to. They're unwittingly expressing their heartless concern for the plight of the widow herself. That's irrelevant to them. Famous former Justice of the US Supreme Court Oliver Wendell Holmes once said, "I might have entered the ministry if certain clergymen I knew had not looked and acted so much like undertakers." We need leaders who bear the fragrance of life, not the stench of death. And it's implicit, isn't it, in the Sadducees' rejection of resurrection, for the temple effectively is a cemetery. I mean, when Moses entered the presence of God, he was communicating with God, the life-giver. But when the Sadducees performed their rituals in the temple, well, they might as well have been trying to communicate with the dead. They're certainly not in touch with a life-giving God. So the fuse keeps burning. It's moving ever closer to the explosive events of Jesus' death and resurrection and the destruction of Jerusalem, the temple, and the theocratic state. So much for scene 3. Well, let's move on to scene 4 then, which is really about sacrificing love. I mean, sacrificing love. You'll get my point as we go on, verses 28 to 34. I mean, just think back to the story that lit the fuse at the beginning of the chapter. Why does the owner keep on sending servants to the vineyard when they keep on getting beaten or killed? Why does he then send his beloved son thinking they will respect him? I guess because he's allowing for exceptions. And we get one here, don't we? We meet a teacher of the law who defies the stereotype. This is a guy who respects Jesus. And indeed, Jesus declares him to be not far from the kingdom of God. And he talks with Jesus about what is most important in all of God's laws. He endorses Jesus' answer, saying, to love God with all your heart, with all your understanding, and with all your strength, and to love your neighbour as yourself is more important than all burnt offerings and sacrifices. Now that's the fruit for which God is seeking. This man's answer is unusually wise precisely because other teachers of the law do not see wholeheartedly loving God and neighbour as more important than burnt offerings and sacrifices. To them, just offering up the burnt offerings and sacrifices is enough to be right with God. A.B. Bruce rightly observed, a ceremony and tradition-ridden time is infallibly a morally corrupt time. So more of the emphasis upon ritual, less on morality. And typically the teachers of the law at the temple, when they're in the temple, as Jesus explained in Mark 11, they'd made the temple into a den of thieves, hadn't they? Into a robber's cave. In other words, they could live up unrighteous lives, they could deny people true justice, and yet by engaging in religious rituals, they could persuade themselves that they had nothing to fear from God. That's really the point that Jesus is making, quoting from Jeremiah. It's as though having stolen from God, having failed to give back to God what is God's, their hearts, their souls, their minds, their strength, the temple is their hideaway, where they are secure from repercussions, and they reassure themselves, oh, we're all right with God, we don't have to worry because we've performed all these religious rituals. So Jesus' story, which lit the fuse, it tells otherwise, the parable, doesn't it? So we come to scene 5 now, and we see people out of their depth in verses 35 to 37. After this encounter, we're told nobody dares to ask Jesus any questions, so Jesus decides it's time to pose one himself. And so he asks why the teachers of the law only think of the Messiah as the son of David, and don't also identify him, as per Psalm 110, as the Lord whose enemies are put under his feet. That's how David addresses him. Now think back to the parable of the tenants. The enemies of the Messiah, the Son of God, that is the leaders who seek to kill him, are going to be defeated because his death is not the end. He will become the cornerstone of the new temple. He will be raised to sit at God's right hand in triumph. And so the leaders opposing Jesus are cruising for a bruising. They're riding for a hiding. They're swimming out of their depth, and there's no lifeguards that are going to be there to stop them from drowning. They're really committing kamikaze, suicide, by the way they're treating Jesus. All right, we move to scene 6 then, and this is where the siren sounds in verses 38 to 40. We can see the fuse, it's continuing to burn its way along that fuse wire. In his autobiography, champion swimmer Ian Thorpe confesses, "I was able to hide my drinking from the battery of sports psychologists and coaches who work with the elite athletes. I appeared psychologically strong, a determined, dedicated athlete, with all the answers about goals and directions to satisfy their criteria. Yet, beneath it all, I was a wreck." Now, do people see us as we really are, or are we pretending to be something or someone we are not? That was the problem with the leaders of Jesus' day. So what comes next is Jesus' total denunciation of these leaders, his enemies, which he ends by saying, "These men will be punished most severely." Why? Because they're actors. They're playing to the crowd, looking for applause and admiration. So they live theatrical lives, walking around in flowing robes, hankering for recognition in the marketplaces, parading their importance in the synagogues and at banquets. There's nothing here about truly wanting to honour and serve God and serve God's people. It's all about them. And when leaders behave like this, it is the vulnerable members of society who suffer. Verse 4, Jesus says they devour widows' houses. Now Dwight Moody points out it's a great deal better to live a holy life than to talk about it. Lighthouses do not ring bells and fire cannon to call attention to their shining. They just shine. We turn now to scene 7. And now we're learning what to look for in verses 41 to 44. So finally there's Jesus. He's sitting opposite the temple. He's looking for any expression of true devotion to God in the way that people are using their money for the upkeep of the temple. And Jesus sees what nobody else sees. And he draws the attention of his disciples to the expression of devotion to God by a poor widow who, significantly, doesn't own any silver coins with the emperor's image on them. She only has some copper coins. So clearly most people are putting silver imperial coins into the treasury. So the Jewish leaders don't care if people give them coins with Emperor Tiberius' image on them. That exposes the hypocrisy of that earlier encounter all the more, doesn't it? So this widow may be poor, but she shows her devotion to God by her astounding generosity of spirit. But she is the exception that proves the rule. The flame continues to move along the fuse wire. So where does this leave you and me? Well, we need to take a good hard look at ourselves, don't we, and ask ourselves some probing questions. Are we living as those persuaded that all of our wealth and money belongs to the Lord? I mean, to what extent is our own piety and religious behaviour an expression of wholehearted love for God and for others? And to what extent has it become an end in itself? How are we manifesting genuine and practical concern for the vulnerable members of our community, especially within our church communities? Sometimes these might be people who are normally considered unattractive or odd or undesirable for one reason or another, not part of the normal circle of people we might relate to. How do we treat them? How do we regard them? Now, we've seen people treating God's temple as though it was a stage on which they could perform and win the acclaim of others. And so now, as much now as ever, we need to be real people, not actors, who enjoy a real, personal and intimate relationship with God. Not like those whom Paul depicts in 2 Timothy chapter 3 verse 5. You know, he describes some people who have a form of godliness but deny its power. It's time to get real. Amen.